So I'm happy to share. Liliana was born in Mexico City and crossed the border to the US at the age of 7 with her family. She was undocumented for 22 years until obtaining LPR status through a U visa 2 years ago. Liliana is a developing decolonial psychologist and doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at the University of San Francisco. She serves as Immigrants Rising mental health advocate and is a doctoral intern at UC Davis, CAPS, AB 540, and Undocumented student track. Liliana was a member of the California Psychological Association Immigration Task Force and has also provided clinical group supervision for developing school counselors. Liliana's clinical and research interests are at the intersection of social justice, community organizing, and activism, trying to understand the mental health effects of anti-immigration policy and racism on immigrant, undocumented, and refugee communities from a decolonial and liberation psychological perspective. Her dissertation focuses on examining the mental health outcomes of various types of fear during the Trump administration among students who have an undocumented legal status. Liliana received the 2020 WebMD Educator Health Hero Award for her work over the past 11 years on raising awareness about the impact of immigration status on health. So with that, I turn it over to our special guest, Liliana Campos.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, Melissa. It's so wonderful to be in community with y'all. To everyone who's here, I can't see your faces. I see your names. I thank you for being here. I thank you for choosing to be in community today. I know it's Thursday afternoon at 5 p.m. So I honor you so much in your choice to be here. And we'll dive a little bit more into what self-care could look like, even in the process of us connecting today and talking about a very intense topic and real experience for many of us. So before we get started, I just want to, just connect with y'all and check in and see how do folks feel? Do you want to stay on the phone? What's accessible to you at this time in terms of what you need? Do you need some break away from the Zoom and just want to listen and connect in that way? Or is there a possibility for us to kind of look at each other or try to kind of envision a communal opportunity? Hi, Charles.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for being here. Hi, Valerie. Hi, Veronica, Sandra, Raisa. Thank you. Yeah, whatever feels comfortable. Hi, Steve. Familiar faces and new faces, Lanisha. Thank you so much. I think it's going to be a pretty small group today, so maybe there's opportunity for us to get a little bit more intimate in some ways and create some safety and sanctuary, and we can kind of think through together what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and move through just the proposed agenda. So maybe do a little bit of like sharing about what brings me into this work. I think Esma did in a very feeling really there's always this like feeling of like, oh my God, make the introduction stop, right? And then I'm really excited to share with you a little bit more about the personal pieces as it relates to racial trauma, as it relates to why this work is so important to me personally and to my community, and how this can be applied to us as healthcare professionals, as service providers, and as people, as members of the community, right? Whether we're directly impacted by immigration, anti-racist policies, and or as allies, right? It also impacts us in many different ways. So we'll have some opportunities to reflect, share, and validate. And that'll happen a little bit throughout. We'll get, we'll talk a little bit more about what is ethno-racial trauma, drawing a little bit of like the personal, drawing a little bit of the research, and kind of think through like, well, what do we do with that, right? How does this then how does racial healing then happen or can happen in our everyday lives, given our various intersecting identities and the many different ways in which we might hold privilege, we might experience oppression differently every day, and where we're at also in our own racial identity, and the spectrum of that. So that's kind of the proposed agenda. I'm also aware that that may or may not happen. So I'm very much, I welcome a lot of authenticity in the sense that, like, you know, we'll see what happens, right? And I think that I really hope that we can co-create an opportunity in a space for also just like the authenticity of whatever you want to share, whatever comes up for you, kind of help guide the back and forth that I hope we can cultivate together today. So just to share with you a little bit about me, and again, right, I think that this is something that shows up in my work every day, whether I'm working clinically with individuals or whether I'm working on a research paper, on a study, right? I think that I hold this very much as a part of my experience and what drives me to kind of think about this work as something that is also in many different ways provide some healing. So this is my family. I'm the daughter of Liliana Campos and Sergio Hernandez, and you'll see them right at the bottom. That's actually a picture of them when they first immigrated to the States. So they were very, very young. And now looking back, I'm like, wow, my parents made this big decision to immigrate, to cross the border. I was separated from my parents when crossing the border. So we can certainly kind of think through, right? Like, what is the impact of even family separation? And we know that that's happening currently, right? That it significantly happened in the Trump administration, and that it continues to exist and happen in many different ways, even now with the Biden administration. And so what is that? What can that do to our mental health? So I'm just kind of dropping in little seeds here and there for us to kind of think about all these different things, right? That's me at SFO and one of the protests against the travel ban against our Muslim brothers and sisters and siblings. And the reason why I share this is because I think for me, even in the context of even doing my own healing as it relates to racial trauma, as it relates to various types of trauma, right? So migration, pre-migration trauma, and the ongoing trauma and experiences that happen as a result of anti-racist policies, of microaggressions, of witnessing violence against undocumented communities, against communities of color, is that activism for me was really, and has been, and continues to be a way of healing, a way in which I think I've really tapped into really understanding how and why racial consciousness and decolonization of both our minds, bodies, and spirits is so foundational to really understanding, right, the impact of violence in the form of colonialism and how that continues to show up every day in our lives. So that's the reason why I showed that. And then here's a picture right next to it of my father and my siblings at the Golden Gate. And that was maybe about 2 days after we immigrated. And I always think of that day as kind of a day, right, where a new life began. So in that context, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, how does grief and loss show up, not just in the context of trauma, when we're working from a trauma-informed care lens, as it relates to immigration status, as it relates to the various ways in which also trauma can leave us grieving what the person that we could have been and the person that we are, right, as a result of many traumatic experiences that happen in relation to, yes, racial trauma, but when we start to unpack racial trauma, we can start to see many different threads of different types of violence that are really informing that. And so for me, that's part of my work. And it's also one of the reasons why I actually now hold status. So for some of you who may be wondering like, well, what is a U visa, right? A U visa is, and I won't go too much into it, but a U visa is intended to, it's a particular, specific type of visa that can grant citizenship for individuals who have been survivors of a crime and have collaborated with the police. We can certainly unpack that from many angles, right? And what that means for communities that hold an undocumented legal status. What does it mean when you transition from not having status to then holding status, right? And, you know, even in the broader scheme of things, right, that maybe if individuals who had protection, who were protected from violence and various types of crime in the first place, right, we could really do some preventative work there. So that's what I'll share around that. And I'll, you know, part of this presentation is inspired by my dissertation, which really focused on looking at various types of fear and how fear and trauma can inform one another. So before we dive into some of the heavy stuff, I want to invite all of us to check in with ourselves today. And I've set out a couple of questions here, and maybe we won't go through all of them, but I want to invite you to pick one. And as we think about like, well, how do we create safe and sanctuary spaces or moments for ourselves and each other, right? There's a difference between safety and sanctuary. And so I invite you to kind of think about that. What does that mean in your role at UCSF? What does that mean as a person that holds many different intersecting identities? Maybe as an ally, right? As a person that's impacted, and also providing some of these services to the community that are impacted. So I welcome you to think about one of these and just take maybe about, I know 30 seconds is not enough time, but think about it. If you feel called to write it out and answer it, feel free to do so. And then we'll do a brief reflect, share, and validate to kind of, you know, think through what this looks like for you and what this could look like for a community and for us right now as we're sharing space and we're in community. And if somebody is ready to share, and I'm happy to go first to hopefully kind of break a little bit of the ice here. So what does safety feel in your body? I'm going to pick that one. So I think for me, in the context of doing racial trauma work, right, and having also been a person impacted by it, I think I do a lot of preparation before, during, and after. So what does safety feel in my body? I think safety for me in my body feels when I can think and feel at the same time. Right? So when that happens for me, I know that my body's feeling safe, right? When I'm having a hard time thinking, or when I'm like really having a hard time feeling, or maybe when I'm in one of those, right? One of those internal experiences is more salient for me. That's when I know I'm being triggered by something, or something doesn't feel safe in my body. So that's what I hope to share with you all. And as I go, as we spend time together today, I'm going to keep checking in with myself, right? How does that safety feel in my body? Does it change over time based on things that come up or that I share? And that'll be part of my self-care that I'd like to share with you all. And that's how I like to cultivate safe and sanctuary within myself and with community. Is there anybody that would like to share?
I'll share. So great to see you, Liliana.
Hi, Steve.
So excited for this workshop.
Oh, I'm excited to see you.
Safety, I think lately feels like staying grounded, definitely grounding myself when I am in moments of feeling anxious or a lot of stressors coming into my body. I have learned to take a moment, stay grounded, and take a few breaths. That has been helpful in terms of staying present and not thinking about the past or the future, but being in the moment and be able to be functional in that moment instead of being trapped by the fear or anxiety. So that's one of the ways that I have learned to feel safe.
Yeah. Thank you so much for reminding us of the power of breath, right? And how it can help us to ground ourselves and staying in the present, right? Sometimes that could be like a little radar, right? When we're like in the future thinking, right? It can be something to help us guide us back into the present moment. Thank you, Steve.
I'm happy to share. This is Veronica. I was reading, I'm like, I don't know what safety means, honestly. For me, it's like, I just want to be stable. Like, I want to be able to like juggle kids at the house, you know, like all the priorities that have to happen with work. That for me, safety, I don't even know how to identify what that means for myself, far less what that means to my body. So I'm curious to see what I take away from this conversation so that I can learn what that means for myself.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I really appreciate you sharing that with us, because I think that is also one of the reasons why I wanted to have us think about this, right? Because what safety might mean for me could be so different for you, right? What I perceive as safe or sanctuary could be very different what that means for you, or what you want to experience. So as you sit with this question of like, I don't know what that is for myself, and we go through this presentation, right? And even beyond, I want to invite you to kind of, again, check back in with your body, check back in with your heart, right? Like think of maybe even a person, like where you felt safe. What is it about that moment or that person that makes you feel safe? Or when you create safety with others, right? How are you feeling in that moment? So I really appreciate you sharing with us and reminding us that safety means many different things for many of us. And I also, as service providers, as allies, I want to welcome that we normalize that question when we're checking in with folks, right? Like, what does safety look like for you? Sometimes we can also get in the habit of saying like, let's create a safe space, but we don't know what that means, right? And so part of doing this work and doing trauma-informed care work is actually checking in with folks and asking, like, well, what does safety look like for you? If we created that, what would be important for us to think about? And so I invite you to think about that for yourself, and also as service providers, right? As healthcare providers, how do we also engage in that process when we're working with other individuals? And maybe we can have another person share, and then we'll transition to the next section. Okay. Well, there will be more time for us to share. So I'll just move through the next slide. So what is ethno-racial trauma? So ethno-racial trauma is defined as systemic and interpersonal violence and trauma that stems from a legacy of oppressive laws, policies, and practices. So we know systemic oppression exists. We know that interpersonal violence and interpersonal racism exists, right? And all of this can lead to individual and collective psychological distress and fear of danger, right? If there's violence happening in our environment, right, that's a threatening thing that it is existing in our environment, and that can impact, it activates, you know, our biological response to protect ourselves, our fight or flight and freeze response. And so we can imagine that if this is constantly happening in a chronic state also, right, that some of the results from experiencing it, so being directly impacted by this or witnessing this kind of violence in the form of discrimination, threats of harm, violence, intimidation directed ethno-racial minority groups, right? Ethnic groups, that the ongoing manifestation of that the ongoing results of that can significantly manifest in many psychological, cognitive, emotional, and physiological presentations. And really, when we're talking about ethno-racial trauma, we're really talking about colonization. We're really talking about the continued effects of colonization that happens every day, right? That still exists, that it exists in the forms of structures, and it exists in the forms of our thoughts, our behaviors, and our attitudes. And that as whether we're descendants of colonizers or whether we are communities that have been colonized, that we aren't impacted by this, that there's a lot of unlearning, that we're being called to do a lot of unlearning and a lot of unpacking, right? And that this is a daily practice, and that it is hard, and that this is part of the racial healing process that also can be accessible to us. So I want to check in with folks. What do you think about this description, this definition? Have you heard of it? Anything coming up for you as we think through this? I know I'm feeling like, even just thinking about it, seeing it, reading it, feels heavy in my body. I know I'm feeling my stomach, right? It feels a little constricted as I'm even kind of sitting with this. Anyone feel called to share? Okay. Well, feel free to do so at any point. And so the impact of racial trauma, right? So when we think about how does this show up for communities of color, how does it show up for white individuals? How does it show up for communities that have been colonized? How does it show up for, when we're thinking about the relationship and the intersectionality between race and identity, especially as we think about immigration status, as we think about race, as we think about colorism? All of these things are so interconnected, and they're interconnected for a reason, right? It's a system, it's a construct that has been set up to help to induce violence, to induce illness, right? To keep people oppressed. The more that we are oppressed, and the more this oppression leads to any psychological manifestations, right? The less time we have to heal. So this is a very strategic form of violence that can lead to many kinds of health-related issues, given that it's constant and chronic. So some of the things that I've already mentioned in terms of, the repeated and chronic exposure of violence in the form of microaggressions. I know sometimes, we think about like, oh, the impact of racial trauma as something that doesn't happen in the Bay Area. We know that's not true, right? It's happening. Our API communities are being directly impacted by this right now. And witnessing, knowing about it, right? So I think that there's the explicit violence that we see, and then there's I don't even like the word micro aggressions, right? An aggression is an aggression, and microaggressions really refer to a discriminatory event that happens against someone's ethnic, racial, linguistic, cultural background, right? And sometimes it can be disguised as a form of even a compliment or something that someone is not aware of, right? Something that can be unintentional. And both people of color, people who have been colonized, and white individuals, we all can be subjected to that, right? We can all be active members of this. So I want to invite us to also kind of think about, well, okay, how do we lean into doing really anti-racist work, right, within ourselves and in our communities? And this also means that as communities of color, right, we have some work to do, in that realm. Specifically for immigrant and undocumented communities, the constant state of fear of deportation and deportability. So the fear of deportation and deportability really aims to get at this experience that if you are brown, if you look immigrant, right? If you fit a certain demographic type that resembles that of what we see as an immigrant, right? What's portrayed as an immigrant, the stereotype, that we're really, it's this race-based discrimination that is happening. And so fear of deportation, right, can lead to, can suggest that, you know, somebody holds a particular immigration status that puts them at risk of deportation. And then we have this fear of deportability that even as somebody who holds maybe immigration status, that the fact that you are an immigrant really gives this sense of fear of deportability. And this can happen in many mixed status families as well. This fear that families will be deported because they're immigrants, even when families hold different immigration statuses. One of the things that I want to invite us to kind of think about, and I'll get to that in a separate slide, is that we often think about fear, right? So when we're even thinking about the fight or flight or freeze response, right? This is a fear response. A lot of the times, or a lot of the ways in which trauma and fear get talked about, specifically as it relates to the experiences of communities that hold an undocumented legal status, is that fear is kind of a salient experience. And through some of the research that I've been doing, particularly looking at various types of fear, one of the things that I actually learned is that it's actually not fear. It's actually anger, right? That anger is really a manifestation of fear. So we know that, right? We have the fight or flight and freeze response. And so I think one of the things that I think in the context of doing trauma-informed care work is really, how do we tap into that, right? How do we make sure that we're addressing the anger piece, and that we're validating that also as an appropriate response to a lot of the injustices and oppression that is happening. So that's one of the things that I want to make sure that, you know, we also start thinking about, that yes, it's fear, and anger is also another response that I think our communities really sit with a lot. More specifically, in terms of the manifestations, the physiological, affective, cognitive, and behavioral effects of ethno-racial trauma, is we know, right, that violence, any kind of threat in our environment, is really an attack on our nervous system, right? Our cortisol levels get impacted, right? There's a chronic activation of our automatic nervous system, right? It takes about 20 to 30 minutes for the parasympathetic nervous system to kick in to kind of help us to feel safe. So in the beginning, I asked y'all, right, like, how does safety feel in your body, right? How do you know that? You can imagine that if our nervous system is getting activated on and off, right? And it takes about 20 to 30 minutes for the parasympathetic system to kick in, to let our brain know that we're actually in a safe zone, right? Considering, right, that maybe the world and the social context in which we live is not safe, right? Racism is not safe. There's a lot of violence that exists. So we can't actually tell our bodies that we're in a safe place, which is why sanctuary here is the key word, right? That we can create sanctuary, and sanctuary meaning that we are able to create moments and times of where our physical nervous system can be regulated. Because we're not saying let's regulate your nervous system so that you can actually adapt to the injustices and the violence that is around you, right? We actually want to also validate, yes, there's a reason to be angry. Yes, there's a reason to be fearful, right? And we also want to be able to engage in some coping strategies to help regulate, right? And that's where sanctuary comes in. And I think that that's where the difference between safe and sanctuary can be applied, even in the context of like, well, how does it show up? How can we practice that in our bodies? And how do we then take that concept and apply it in our practice, right? As allies, as service providers, within our roles in institutions, right? That we know systemic racism exists. We know that the racialization of medical care still exists, right? So how, you know, how do we tap into that within that role in the work that we're doing and that we want to do? So more specifically, again, I'm not going to go too much into this, but some of the physiological pieces, which we kind of talked a little bit about, right? The psychological, so, you know, cognitive attention difficulties, hypervigilance, attachment. As I go even through this, I also want to invite us to kind of think about these as protective and survival responses, right? That some of these actually have to happen in the moment in order for us to survive that particular moment, right? So even if we think about a microaggression, right? And I'll use myself as an example. I might have a really hard time paying attention afterwards, right? My automatic nervous system has been activated. I may have chosen to say something to address it or not. Maybe I didn't, but it's still going to impact me, right? And I might be having a really hard time attending to even the conversation that is happening, to the presentation that is happening, or to whatever I'm trying to attend, right? So you can imagine that that internal response is so activated, it's so heavy, right? That at some point I actually do have to tune off, right? My mind in order to be able to just regulate in that moment. So a lot of these different things have different functionalities. Of course, over time, can they lead to greater difficulties? Yes. And this is why racial healing trauma work is so important. This is why anti-racist work is so important. And this is why we ourselves, right, can have the capacity to do that for ourselves, and then also do that in the collective context, right? Given our roles in the community. I'll go a little bit more into grief and loss and anger in just a minute. Any questions? Thoughts?
Lily, I think there was a question about what does AOD mean under behavioral?
Yeah, so thank you for that. Alcohol and other drugs. Yeah, so substances, right? Substances can be a way to help regulate. And substances can also lead to addiction and all sorts of other things. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? All right. So grief and loss. So I'm really inspired, and I want to show you all this. Wait, you can't see me, right? Because the presentation is happening. Is that right? I'm having like a Zoom brain fart.
No, we can see you.
You can see it. Okay. Okay. Not webinar. Okay. You can see me. I can't see it. Okay. So here's this. Can you see this? What I'm showing, the Racial Healing Handbook? No. Okay. So maybe I'll show that in a little bit, but well, what I'm holding is called the Racial Healing Handbook, and it includes a lot of practical activities to help us challenge privilege, confront systemic racism, and engage in a collective healing. Actually, one of the things that we're doing at UC Davis is that as staff and faculty, we're reading, we got to choose a number of books, and we have these monthly diversity dialogues where we engage in conversations around like racism and microaggressions and all sorts of different things. And some of us are actually using this book to help guide this conversation. And I also use this book a lot in session with clients. I use this book to help guide the next couple of slides that I'll be referencing. And this handbook, I find it so helpful because I think it's written in a way, it's written for white individuals, it's written for POC, and I like it because I think it gives us an opportunity to kind of understand the different ways in which we might process racial trauma, right? Because we do. That's the reality, that we navigate the world differently and that we're seen by the world differently. And it can be a great opportunity for all of us to kind of take a look at like, well, where are we on the spectrum of our own racial identity, right? And some of the prompts used there really can help us reflect, engage in our own uncomfortability, and even think through like, well, what are the many times where maybe I've addressed this, or like what was happening within me that, you know, I wasn't able to call that out, right? What are the many privileges that maybe I hold? Where am I on the spectrum of white fragility, right? Of internalized racism and all sorts of different things. So I invite you to, you know, check out that book. Thank you, Melissa, for putting the link there. I really like it. I'm using it both personally and for my work. And like I said, it helped inspired some of the presentation here. So one of the things that they talk about is grief and loss as it relates to when we're really tapping into some racial healing work, right? That for some of us, there might be this realization that that we have been conditioned, we have been colonized, right? To think that we are inferior to white individuals, right? And that might impact the ways that we think of ourselves, right? That could impact our body image, the way that we feel or perceived in the world, right? From the color of our skin to the ways in which we might be uncomfortable with that. And so that's some of the ways in which grief and loss can happen. The feeling of hopelessness or anger after experiencing daily microaggressions, denying that we're impacted by racism, right? Feeling guilty about the ways we uphold racism, colorism, anti-Blackness, being afraid to make a mistake when it comes to racism. This could be another thing, right? I think especially, I know this resonated a lot with me for a while when I was really struggling with a lot of different things and really trying to like decolonize my body, mind, and spirit, where I really was afraid to make a mistake. Maybe that I was going to say the wrong thing, or that I was going to hurt someone's feelings, that I was going to hurt, you know, when calling out white privilege or white fragility, that I was going to hurt someone's feelings. And I think I sit with that a lot. I think that's still part of my work, my personal work. And I think that it shows up a lot also just in my role as a developing clinician, and now stepping into many different types of privilege, and still holding a lot of still feeling oppressed in many different ways, right? And the many institutions that I interact with every day. And lastly, experiencing fear or hesitation when challenging, I mentioned that, excuse me, and feeling stuck with the anger involving a racist situation. And I think that this was something that was mentioned earlier, right? And so what happens when we encounter, when we're faced with a situation or interaction that is discriminatory, that's racist, that stirs up that physiological, right, trauma trigger in us, that we might sit with that anger. So again, I point out anger because I think that generally when we talk about trauma, we tend to talk about fear. And I think that we do need to be talking about anger just as much. And of course, the freeze response, which sometimes it's like we get stuck. We don't know what to do, right? We just feel like we're stuck in that moment in time. So it's 5:44. And I think I'm doing okay with time. All right, so healing racial trauma continued, right? So again, a lot of what I've been mentioning already has been the internal experience that we have, right? So the physiological experiences that we have when we're faced with racial violence, when we're healing from racial trauma, when we're triggered, right? And when we're triggered, a trigger can feel like a very intense emotion, a very intense physiological response, a very intense behavioral or relational response that we might have. And that can be a manifestation of racial trauma. So again, right, what does that look like? And that could look like in many different ways for somebody. So I think I'll use myself as an example again. I think one of the things that I'm really mindful of is when sometimes I don't know if it's, I question myself a lot. This is also what trauma does, right? We tend to question our intuition, right? So a lot of this work is really calling for us to really go back, right, into our intuition and really trust, right? That also for many of us, right? Like we know what oppression feels like. We know what exploitation feels like. We know what violence feels like, right? Because we've navigated and survived a whole world that is set up in that way for many of us. And so for me, I often go into my physiology again, right? Like, how is my stomach feeling? Is this anxiety or am I really triggered? And I think for me, stomach pains are really how it shows up when I feel like there's something just not right here, right? There's maybe a microaggression. I'm like, wait, was that a microaggression? Was I triggered? Was my response appropriate to that context? Right. So I think for me, the ways in which I've also been doing a lot of my own healing work is really going back into my intuition. And a lot of that is just going back into my physiology. So even, if we take it back to the first question of like, what does safety look like for you? When you think of safety, how does that feel in your body? Right. Again, I go back into my internal experience. Then we can focus on the external systems that reinforce and uphold oppression and racial trauma, right? So again, we know that systemic racism exists, and we know that systemic racism can transfer and translate into the interpersonal, right? And that we need to understand the sociocultural and sociopolitical context to really understand why even a survival response is showing up, right? Because when we focus so much on the symptoms and only the symptoms, then we can really get into some dangerous territory, right? Where we're then pathologizing individuals. So when we centralize even a presenting concern, if you will, or a symptom, whether that be stomach aches, right? Whether that be many different kinds of things. It's so important that we understand and equally evaluate the sociocultural and political context, right? Especially what is happening in the community. What does racial violence look like for that specific community at that given time? And then moving on, establishing safety, right? Symptom stabilization, reprocessing and reconnecting to ourselves and others is among some of the recommendations in terms of racial healing trauma that has been recommended when working with communities who hold an undocumented legal status, communities that have experienced colonization, right? So again, that safety can be momentarily, right? That can help us to stabilize ourselves, get ourselves grounded so that we can think and feel again, and we can re-engage, not just with our bodies, but with each other and with the world, right? And that can look also in the form of reprocessing. Maybe we need to reprocess some of this trauma, right? It also is not required, right? But for some of us, that might be helpful, and we might be ready to do that. And then that can allow us to reconnect back with ourselves. What do we need, right? What is our intuition saying? And that can help us to reconnect back with the outside world. And then just lastly, liberation psychology. I've been actually doing, I've been mentioning a lot of liberation psychology throughout. So the reflection piece, the really emphasizing ethno-racial trauma as sort of not sort of, but as the catalyst for all of this is what liberation psychology calls us to do, right? So it really calls us to think about, well, what are the socio-political, social constructs that have been set up to reinforce and promote that oppression, right? And that oppression can really also puts us at risk for illness. So again, we need to change the systems, right, in order for us to heal and get better. And that healing can also happen simultaneously by creating sanctuary within us and each other. Again, our identities are not the problem, right? It's the interlocking systems of oppression and racism that are. And again, our immigration status puts us at risk, right? And that undocumented status is a social condition and not an identity, right? We were not born undocumented, right? This is a social construct. And that, yes, anybody has the freedom, should identify themselves however they want. And also part of racial consciousness is really understanding that immigration status is, it's a strategy, right? And that part of externalizing it is thinking about it from that framework and really being able to kind of think about, well, what are your many other identities, right, that you hold that may or may not be informing the experiences that one has due to immigration status. And then here are some additional things that I think I already talked about, right? So strengthen individual racial identity by increasing individual and collective consciousness, racial consciousness. I think I missed that. Becoming anti-racist, right? As people of color, colonized communities, communities that experience oppression, right? This obviously is equally as important for white individuals, right? And we know that there's also a lot of racism that exists within ethnic groups, right? We know that that happens. And I think that this pandemic also has been calling us to do that a lot and do that more actively in our communities, in our friendships, with our families. Identify and welcome existing and new survival coping strategies. So again, I think I mentioned that when I was going through the various manifestations of racial trauma. And then how do we apply this to our everyday lives, right? So this work is daily work. And also, right, we can engage in self-preservation. We don't have to respond to every battle that we experience. And so with that, let's see if we can do a little bit of reflection, sharing, and validation. So where are folks at? I think that's kind of the end of the heavy stuff, the real stuff. And then we'll dive into more real stuff called hope. Where are people at? Where are y'all at?
So much for sharing, Liliana. Everything that you covered has been so insightful in terms of the intersection of mental health and also racial trauma and the effects of oppression and colonization that lingers throughout our society and how it affects our mental health. I wonder what your opinion is in terms of the role of providers who are working in mental health at the hospital or clinics or in different settings, and they continue to see mental health issues in a lot of minority communities. And as we know that racial trauma and oppression is one of the things that are triggering this kind of response, what is the role and what can they do?
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you being here and I appreciate the question. I think that's a question that I sit with every day, right? As a developing provider and as a person of the community. And I think that it's so many different things, right? I think what the focus of this presentation is also, encouraging us to go a little bit inwards, right? Sometimes we want to go out into the community, right? And engage in a whole lot of activism work. And yes, that's important. I think that's necessary. I think we can do that. And also, what does the internal work look like? So again, right? What are our biases? What are our feelings? When do we feel uncomfortable when we talk about racism and racial trauma? How are we decolonizing our bodies and minds and spirits every day, right? And I think this happens relationally. I think that's how it manifests, right? So from the point of contact with our patients, our clients, with our community, right? how are we engaging with them, whether it be in a nonverbal way, in a verbal way, the many different practices that exist, right, structurally. How do we deconstruct that? And I think, I think your question really reminds me of like, well, within my role, right? Like, what is even some of the power that I might hold? And how can that be used as a way to really deconstruct? So I know I'm giving you a pretty abstract, right, reflection or answer. And I think the practical for me is really going inwards. So again, right, checking in with yourself and thinking through like, well, how can you create safety for yourself, sanctuary for yourself? And then how does that then translate out into the community? Yeah, some more thoughts. I welcome any other additional thoughts. I'm certainly not the expert in this, but I think we all are, and we all hold so much knowledge and experience. So any other thoughts? Reflections? Welcome any feedback too, challenges. Feel free to challenge this too.
I could share a reflection. I came from Mexico when I was 5, crossed the border illegally with my family members. First time I ever met my father was when I was, I think it was 4.5 or 5, can't even remember. So I was texting my partner to figure out like, what's my mechanism, right? And in terms of like my trauma, I know that I forget things. That's how I deal with things. But then all of a sudden I get angry, right? If it's not how I perceive myself, that's a lot of the issues, is how other people perceive me. My skin color, my hair color, whether I do it dark or I just let it, whatever color it comes out. I noticed that when my last name was Carlos versus now it's nephew, the perception that people have about who I am and where I come from, it's always very different based on where I live in my community, and even at work, they perceive you differently. When I had black hair, it would be like, oh, like in your neighborhood where there's all these shootings, right? I'm like, well, I never went through that, but that's what you're perceiving based on what this looks like, right? Well, whether I have curly hair or I straighten it, I noticed that all this, where I live, what I wear, becomes a stereotype of even my nationality, whether they think I'm Mexican or from another country, right? But one of the things that I'm learning about myself going through all this is I forget things. When I went through my divorce, it was like, you did all these things. I'm like, I don't remember, right? Like, or sometimes my family members are like, remember this? I'm like, I have no idea if that even happened. Was I even there? Yes, you were. I don't remember. But when you talked about triggers, and yes, when somebody calls me Veronica, I'm like, what? Right? Because that's when somebody's angry at me, they call me Veronica, and I'm used to going by Vero, Verito. And so when people call me Vero, Veronica is like, I feel somebody's upset at me. Yeah. Or when my partner crosses his arms, or like, it's like, oh my God, you're like with my dad when he was like drinking, right? Like I feel like I'm being attacked. But I don't remember what happened. I just remember like words or behaviors that all of a sudden make me feel unsafe. So safety for me, it's really hard to explain because I'm just numb, right? Because I'm forgetting things. So this was really good exercise because I'm sort of like learning more about myself, but I will continue to examine what that safety means in to my body, right? So I appreciate this conversation because I'm trying to understand myself a little bit more, right? Not so what others perceive or what others think about me, but I think I'm awesome, but you know, like, right? But it's more about like what others perceive me hurt me.
Yeah.
Right. And then I just let it go, but I know that it's not letting it go because it's staying within me.
Yeah.
It manifests itself in another situation where I could be talking to somebody else and I'm getting mad at them for something that somebody did 5 months ago.
Yeah.
So I need to examine that within myself. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah. No, and thank you. I appreciate your vulnerability and trust and sharing your experience with us and naming it, right? And really thinking through like, well, how does this apply, right? And is there an opportunity here for some self-exploration? So I really appreciate you sharing that with us and trusting this space. And, you know, I may continue to invite you to kind of, yeah, like you said, think about like, well, what does safety look like? And what did it feel like to share that? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for providing the safe space. I know a lot of people on the call, so it's like I felt safe,
yeah.
Right? So I appreciate everyone else, and thank you.
Yeah.
I know we're getting close to time, so I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you, Liliana, Esme, and Melissa for coordinating and bringing you into our community. You know, one of the things that I'll just add as a fellow mental health professional and psychologist is this piece around racial trauma and the not recognizing that going through graduate and professional education is a form of harm in many, many ways. And it is called, you know, professionalism. We give it all these other names, but it has a ability to engage in a lot of stripping of identity and of personal narrative and of personal history. And I think that when it comes to sort of this concept of, you know, you talked about decolonization and, you know, what is racial trauma, I think that it's also really important, particularly for our learners and for us as educators, to recognize that the socialization into systems of academia or even professional work is a very, very slow grind of trauma. And coming out of it on the other end, people not recognizing who they are, who they were, and being able to hold on to their sense of identity. And it's just very difficult, I think, to really tease apart what is my own beliefs or what have I sort of been indoctrinated into over time. And I just think that it's something that needs to be named alongside of, yeah, we can sort of recognize these obvious places where either they're macroaggressions or overt, you know, harms that come up, you know, whether in our social consciousness or the political climate. But there's just small, like everyday, really insidious things that happen to people that really take them away from their sense of selves. And it's called by another name. And oftentimes that is professionalism.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hill. I really appreciate you calling us into that, right? Because I think I'm wondering, I'm like, oh, could that be part 2? Could we go deeper into that, right? And I think that, yes, I think it's so true, right? I think it happens for many of us. And I think this loss of identity, of trying to find ourselves, right, in academia can be so violent. And it's, you know, so when we talk about, you know, isolation, not knowing what we're doing, right, all these different things, it's because we're trying to survive, right? This very violent institution that is reinforcing a lot of the trauma that in many ways we're trying to address every day. So thank you. I appreciate you calling us into that. Well, I know we're past our time, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I want to make sure that we kind of leave with a little bit of, you know, grounding, and I know I didn't get to talk a whole lot about hope, but you know, these are, you know, just again reflective questions that I welcome you to kind of think about. And, you know, kind of check back in with yourself. How is your body feeling? What do you need to cultivate hope? What has helped you in the past when cultivating and maintaining hope? So again, this is another one, right? Where we might be exploring what that means for us.
I just want to say thank you, Liliana. Thank you for bringing this conversation to us. I know, you know, just knowing you for many years now, I know how you continue to bring it in many different ways. And I'm so happy that you got to share with us today. For everyone, thank you so much for being here. I still notice like some of the heaviness I'm still sitting with, right, as we process. And I imagine some of the silence may also be like sort of digesting and processing what we just heard today. So I do invite you to take the time to transition, to take care of yourselves before you transition to the next thing. Thank you so much.